If Lord Peter Wimsey had not misquoted Mendelssohn in front of a bishop's wife, it is entirely possible that no one would have discovered the body until after the Easter hymnals had been put away. The occasion was the annual musicale at Fernclose House, a Georgian monstrosity crouched indecisively on the Dorsetshire coast, its windows bulging with the salt of 27 seasons and its stone griffins looking terminally affronted by the sea. The house belonged to the Honourable Mrs. Marigold Vine, a woman of austere piety and alarming musical enthusiasms, who had assembled a curious population of minor clergy, dispossessed nieces, and musical hangers-on for what she called her Holy Harmonies weekend. The bishop's wife, Mrs. Craik Wentworth, had recently taken up an enthusiasm for plain song, and Wimsey, invited more, one suspected, for comic relief than for musical contribution, had been strategically seated beside her for the opening recital. "It's quite wrong, you know," he murmured, as the soprano essayed a perilous descent in G-flat minor. "Mendelssohn never orchestrated Ave Maria. You're thinking of Gounod's ghastly appropriation of Bach. A musical kidnapping, if one may be so bold." Mrs. Craik Wentworth, who had in fact not been thinking of any such thing, turned toward him with the baffled dignity of one unused to correction during a solo. "Lord Peter," she said, "I was referring to the modulation. It struck me as, well, not quite ecclesiastical." Wimsey gave a deferential bow of the head and murmured, "Ecclesiastical, perhaps, but not canonical." It was at precisely this moment that the music faltered. A stray thump echoed from the drawing-room, like a bench being overturned or perhaps a large book falling spine-first onto the parquet. A few heads turned, and Mrs. Vine, sitting bolt upright at the front like a particularly upright metronome, gave a crisp nod to the pianist, Miss Elfrida Smart, who resumed playing as though nothing had occurred. But Lord Peter's head had cocked slightly, not toward the pianist, but toward the far end of the room where the bay window arched into shadow. Beside it stood the tall, ornate piano stool, of the absurd Victorian sort that combined function with unwieldy ornamentation and was, Wimsey noted, unusually empty for a music weekend. After the recital, an affair which included 2 madrigals, a woeful cello solo, and a posthumous piece by someone described as criminally overlooked, there was tea in the anteroom and a mild confrontation over cucumber sandwiches. It was then that Wimsey, under pretext of needing to consult the libretto of the air freshener, excused himself and wandered back into the drawing-room. The afternoon sun slanted low through the bay window, highlighting motes in the air and lending a golden veneer to the polished wood. But something was wrong, ever so slightly. The faintest whiff of something, neither ecclesiastical nor canonical, drifted beneath the fog of lavender and old lace. Wimsey wrinkled his nose. Then he saw it, behind the heavy lid of the upright piano, where the stool had been tucked out of the way, neatly, even reverently. Something protruded. A foot. Small, gloved, female, rather too immobile for someone napping through a fugue. "Ah," murmured Lord Peter. "A nocturne in D-flat, de mortui nihil nisi bonum, though I suspect even the departed would object to this harmony." With a delicacy born of long acquaintance with untimely corpses, he stepped forward and knelt. The foot was attached, unsurprisingly, though one never entirely knows, to a body tightly wedged between piano and panelled wall. Her head rested at an impossible angle beneath the piano lid, which had not closed fully, an oversight either by the killer or the corpse herself. "Miss Cassandra Keene," he said softly, brushing back a strand of graying hair from the lifeless brow. "And only yesterday you were arguing about Schumann with the vicar, a deeply unwise pastime for a woman of nerves." At that precise moment, the bishop's wife entered with a plate of Battenberg. She said. "Lord Peter, is that one of the musicians?" "Yes," said Wimsey, rising, "but I'm afraid her encore's been cancelled." The ensuing moments at Fernclose House unfolded with that particular blend of decorum and horror unique to English country gatherings interrupted by death. Mrs. Craik Wentworth, upon receiving Wimsey's declaration with the composure of one accustomed to funerals, but not to discovering them by accident, set down her Battenberg and murmured something about informing Mrs. Vine. Wimsey, meanwhile, remained where he stood, arms lightly crossed and head tilted, as though observing a curious bit of statuary in the British Museum. It was a ghastly scene, if one allowed oneself the indulgence of adjectives. But Wimsey appeared not remotely horrified. Rather, he seemed slightly irritated, as though some small but vital element of the afternoon's musical progress had been bungled and required reorchestration. Miss Cassandra Keene had been, to the best of anyone's knowledge, entirely alive at the start of the recital. A pianist of repute in certain rarefied musical circles, and infamous in others for her opinions on Brahms. She had been staying at Fern Close as Mrs. Vine's guest for nearly a fortnight. This much Wimsey remembered being told the evening prior, as he and Mrs. Vine had passed through the conservatory on their way to an evening reading of The Cloud of Unknowing. Wimsey had been rather more interested in the sherry decanter at the time, but he recalled the name, if only because it had been spoken in the hushed tones reserved for divas, duchesses, and nervous breakdowns. By the time the police arrived, a process that, given the antiquity of the house telephone and the temperament of the local constable, took somewhat longer than one might wish, Wimsey had already conducted a most delicate reconnaissance. He had not moved the body, of course, being no barbarian, but he had taken the liberty of opening the lid of the piano with a handkerchief and peering inside, and had also examined the stool, the floorboards, and the faint indentation on the carpet where, presumably, Miss Keene had last sat down. Sergeant Gallows, whose name, in Wimsey's estimation, gave him an unfortunate thematic disadvantage, arrived puffing and pink-faced, accompanied by a constable with a notebook and the sort of moustache that denoted either extreme virtue or severe constipation. The sergeant had the decency not to treat Wimsey as a meddler, though his tone bore the resigned wariness of a man who knew he was being professionally outpaced. "Well, my lord," he said, after inspecting the body with a practiced squint, "looks to be natural. No marks, no signs of struggle. Perhaps the lady had what do you call it? One of them fainting heart attacks." Wimsey shook his head gently. "Ah, Sergeant, you wound me. A woman who survived both the Paris Conservatoire and 5 years of private instruction under a Hungarian with mother issues does not simply expire without making a sound. And yet no one heard a thing, not a crash, not a cry, only that peculiar thump. Maybe she slipped." "Perhaps," said Wimsey. "Or perhaps she was helped to slip, and then tucked away so as not to spoil the misère." The sergeant looked troubled. "But then, where's the motive? I mean, you're not suggesting foul play just because she had odd ideas about Chopin." "Ah, if only all our grudges were so high-minded. No, I suggest nothing. I merely point out that the scene lacks a certain musicality." Wimsey turned toward the open door as footsteps approached. It was Mrs. Vine, her expression more strained than shocked, which Wimsey took to mean that she had already heard from Mrs. Craik Wentworth, who, though saintly, was not immune to the galvanizing properties of scandal. "This is a dreadful thing, Lord Peter," she said, folding her hands so tightly that her knuckles paled. "Cassie, Miss Keene, was a difficult woman, but I never imagined—" She trailed off. "You never imagined she might end up under your piano," Wimsey offered gently. "Nor I, though I confess I never imagined someone keeping 2 copies of Tristan and Isolde beside the biscuit tin either, so perhaps we are all continually being astonished." "She was peculiar," Mrs. Vine said after a moment. "Temperamental, very sensitive. Sensitive enough to climb behind an upright piano and die quietly?" Wimsey inquired. "Tone light, but eyes keen." "No, I mean, good heavens, no, not in that sense. I didn't mean she was unstable." You did, but that's perfectly all right. It helps, actually. Mrs. Vine flushed. Well, she had habits. She liked her tea at a certain hour. She didn't like to be disturbed in the mornings. She loathed hymns. Yet here she was, at a hymn-filled weekend. She owed me, Mrs. Vine said quickly. She asked to stay. I let her come. She said she needed quiet to finish a composition. Said she had some unfinished business. Musical, I assumed. Said Whimsy. Well, it's finished now. Sergeant Gallows cleared his throat. We'll need to speak with everyone who is in the house between noon and 4 o'clock. Indeed, said Whimsy. You may begin with the servants, Sergeant. I shall amuse myself with the guests, though in all honesty, I find butlers more transparent than baritones. He excused himself and went in search of Miss Elfrida Smott, the pianist from the recital. She was in the conservatory, staring miserably at a rubber plant and picking at a thread on her sleeve. Terribly sorry to disturb, Whimsy began, sitting down beside her. But as the last person to play the instrument in question, alive at least, you may be able to assist us. I didn't see anything, Miss Smott said quickly. I swear, I came in just before the recital. The stool was there. No one said anything about her. I thought she was in her room. She said she had a headache after lunch. Indeed. And do you recall precisely what time you entered the drawing room? About 3 o'clock. I was tuning up. I always like to get the pedals right. And did the piano sound normal? She blinked. Yes, I think so. No odd reverberations, extra dampening, curious notes struck somewhere around the lower octaves. She shook her head, puzzled. No, wait. Actually, now you mention it, the F below middle C was duller than usual. I thought the pedal might be slipping, but it seemed fine once I started playing. Whimsy smiled. Yes, dead weight often settles into place if you play loudly enough. She went pale. You don't mean... She was in there while I was, oh God. Quite possibly, said Whimsy. Though you needn't feel responsible, I once played La Campanella during a fire evacuation without noticing. He patted her hand and rose. One last thing. Do you know if Miss Keene had any enemies here? Friends? Lovers? Miss Smott hesitated. She quarreled with Mr. Fitzarthur yesterday. I didn't hear what it was about, but they were shouting. Something about betrayal and Bach, I think. Dreadful combination, Whimsy murmured. Thank you, Miss Smott. You've been most illuminating. As he strolled back toward the hallway, a clock chimed 4. Whimsy paused and glanced at it, frowning slightly. The note seemed wrong somehow, half a beat behind, like a duet sung by distracted lovers. He made a mental note to ask about the clocks, and perhaps about Mr. Fitzarthur. But first, the servants. One always began with the quiet ones. They rarely lied, and when they did, they lied badly. Whimsy smiled. The performance, it seemed, was just beginning. The drawing room had been cordoned off, or at least as much as one could cordon anything in a house where every second chair was a reproduction of a medieval reliquary, and every guest assumed themselves above suspicion. The police, with the reluctant grace of men accustomed to simple burglaries and the odd poached pheasant, moved about the house like dogs in a gallery, sniffing but not quite knowing where to bark. Whimsy, after a quiet conversation with the cook, who had heard, "Not a peep, sir, but the walls are thick and the guests are thicker," made his way to the servants' corridor. It was a narrow strip of flagged stone that smelt faintly of starch and beetroot, punctuated by tightly shut doors and the distant rhythm of industrious cutlery polishing. He liked servant quarters. The logic of them soothed the mind. It was difficult to imagine murder blooming there, though he had known it to do so with surprising frequency. He tapped on the door marked housekeeper and was greeted by Miss Chisel, a woman who looked like she'd been professionally disapproving since birth. She greeted him without warmth, but not without respect. He had, after all, shown a willingness to speak properly and not charge about shouting for fingerprints and motives like some American in a thriller. "She'd had a row with someone," Miss Chisel said after a moment's silence. "Not loud, mind you, but tight, you know the kind." Whimsy did. The sort of quarrel that began with civility and ended with a syllable that snapped. "When was this?" he asked. "Yesterday morning, just before luncheon. I was polishing the hall mirror, heard voices in the blue drawing room, hers and Mr. Fitzarthur's." "Ah, our angry tenor." "Not angry, my lord. Tight, like I said. Not a raised voice between them, but you could hear the teeth behind it." "And did you, by some prodigious accident, happen to catch what they were saying?" The housekeeper sniffed. "It's not my habit to linger, sir, but I did hear her say, 'If it comes out, it will ruin both of us.' Just like that. Not whispering. Clear as anything." Whimsy rubbed his chin. "Indeed. And what was Mr. Fitzarthur's reply?" "Didn't say a word. Just walked out. Door slammed hard enough to shake the mirror." "Unmusical, but expressive. Thank you, Miss Chisel." She inclined her head like a courtier at the execution of a particularly irritating rival and returned to her accounts, which appeared to involve weighing soap. Whimsy retraced his steps to the front hallway, where the ancient grandfather clock ticked with the deliberate patience of an undertaker. He paused before it. It had struck 4 several minutes late earlier. Now it ticked in rhythm with his watch. Curious. Fitzarthur, Mr. Clarence Fitzarthur, to give him the full burden of his name, was in the conservatory, smoking as though his life depended on it and staring with the glazed intensity of a man trying to remember whether he had confessed to anything yet. Whimsy joined him without preamble. "You are fond of her?" Fitzarthur jumped, then gave a tight little laugh. "You don't waste time." "Only when there's some to waste. You are fond of Miss Keene." The man considered this. He was tall, narrow-shouldered, with a high forehead and a voice that suggested amateur dramatics. "Yes," he said eventually. "I was. Once. But not recently." "Hardly." "She was impossible. She had the temperament of a ruined souffle." "But you loved her?" Fitzarthur gave him a sideways glance. "Don't do that." "Do what?" "Make it sound like a psychological diagnosis." Whimsy shrugged. "I leave that to the Freudians and the novelists. But something happened yesterday morning. She threatened to reveal something. Something that would ruin both of you." Fitzarthur turned pale. "Oh, don't bother denying it," Whimsy continued lightly. "Miss Chisel has ears like a bat and a conscience like granite. She heard the whole thing." For a moment, Fitzarthur said nothing. Then he exhaled slowly and dropped the cigarette into a flower pot. "She meant the thing at Oxford," he said. "Ah," said Whimsy with interest. "The thing. There is always one, isn't there?" "It wasn't a crime," Fitzarthur said. Not as such. It was a scandal, but no one died. Not then." "Do tell." He hesitated. Then, perhaps feeling the grim gravitational pull of confession, he began. "Cassie and I were both at Magdalen. She was older, already a pianist of some repute. I was a postgrad, studying music theory. She was brilliant, erratic. She liked playing with people, pushing them. One of our lecturers, fellows really, got caught up in it. There were letters, an affair, nothing terribly original. But the man had a wife, and Cassie liked to break things." "Did she expose him?" "She didn't have to. The letters surfaced in her room after she'd left, found by a cleaning woman. Very dramatic. The man resigned in disgrace. Went off to Italy, I think. Rumor was that Cassie planted the letters herself, just to see what would happen. Delightful. I tried to defend her. I thought she'd been set up, but then I found one of the letters in my own case. She'd put it there, deliberately, as if to see whether I'd keep it or burn it or give it back." "And you did?" "What?" "I confronted her. She laughed, said music was all deception. She told me once that she liked the idea of ruining lives more than the actual effort of doing so." Did she keep the letters? Burned them, I think. Or said she did. But there was always the chance she had copies. And you were worried she might have decided to let them slip back into the world? She said something yesterday about consequences, that the past would always echo forward. She was in a strange mood. Stranger than usual? Fitzarthur gave a weary shrug. With Cassie, one never quite knew. Whimsy stood, brushed an imaginary speck from his trousers. Thank you. I do believe I've heard just enough to be tantalized. He left Fitzarthur staring into the ferns and returned once more to the drawing room, where the corpse had now been respectfully removed and a faint chalk outline preserved upon the carpet. A constable hovered, as though unsure whether to dust the piano or bow to it. Whimsy nodded at him and stepped to the window. From there, one could see the sloping lawn and the path leading toward the chapel, unused these days except for aesthetic purposes. There was a faint smear on the glass, a handprint, small, feminine, near the lock. He examined it. It was old, days old, possibly, but smudged atop it was something fresher, a streak of red-brown. He scraped at it gently with a matchstick, then sniffed. Not blood, not quite. Varnish, the kind used on piano hammers. Odd. He turned back toward the piano and lifted the lid once more. Something beneath the strings glinted faintly. He reached in and drew out a splinter, curved, stained, and broken at one end. It was part of the piano stool's decorative leg, broken clean through. The stool itself had appeared intact, but only at a glance. He crouched and examined it more closely. The right leg, closest to the keys, was a replacement. Slightly mismatched, the carving newer, the varnish glossier. A very recent repair. He stood. So, she had not merely fallen. She had sat. The leg had snapped. She had struck her head, perhaps, but that was not enough to kill. Unless... He moved swiftly to the servant corridor, found the boot room. There, beside a collection of galoshes and a sullen umbrella, sat a hammer. Clean. Too clean. He held it in gloved fingers and smiled. Now he merely had to ask, who had access to the tools? Who had a reason to damage a piano stool? And who had known Cassandra Keene would play precisely that piece at precisely that hour? He made a mental note to find Miss Elfrida Smott again. The performance was growing richer by the minute. Whimsy found Miss Elfrida Smott in the library, half submerged in a tattered volume of The Golden Bough, and wearing an expression of scholarly martyrdom, as though she had taken on the burdens of comparative religion merely to spare lesser minds the trouble. Her hair, which under less academic circumstances might have aspired to prettiness, was pinned in the careless loops of one preoccupied by higher concerns, or, perhaps, by a consciousness of appearance that wished not to appear concerned with appearances. Whimsy entered quietly, plucked a slim volume from the shelf at random, Haunted Houses of Surrey, and seated himself in the deep chair across from her. He waited until she noticed him. "You believe in signs, Miss Smott?" he asked conversationally. "Omens, that sort of thing?" She glanced up, startled. "Omens? I thought you were here about the murder. But that's all signs and portents, isn't it? A chair collapses, a life ends, and suddenly everyone remembers strange dreams and flickering candles. I don't believe in superstitions, Lord Peter." "No, I rather thought not. But you were, I believe, close to Miss Keene." Elfrida closed her book. "Close is a word one must handle carefully. I knew her. We rehearsed together. I turned her pages occasionally, and I liked her, in small, controlled doses. Page-turning is a delicate art, requires an almost psychic rapport. Or nerves of steel. She had a habit of changing tempo mid-bar. Ah, the musical equivalent of pulling the emergency brake at 35 miles an hour. Tell me, who would have tuned the piano before the recital?" She blinked. "Mr. Haskins, the groundskeeper. He looks after the instruments. Used to be a piano technician, I think." "And the stool?" Has it always been that one? Her eyes narrowed. No. The original was replaced last week. One of the legs cracked during the spring recital. It wobbled dreadfully. Cassandra complained about it for days until someone did something. And was it Haskins who repaired it? I think so. It's not an antique or anything, just decorative. But it had sentimental value for Lady Dormer. Something about it having belonged to a cousin who played at Queen Mary's garden party. Touching. And the piece Miss Keene played. Was it her usual choice? No. Elfrida frowned slightly. She changed her program last minute. Said she felt like something more forceful. Chose the Rachmaninoff prelude instead. Very dramatic. She was in a mood. What sort of mood? Elfrida hesitated, brushing a curl back from her cheek with something almost defensive in the gesture. She was brittle, wired. She'd had a row with Clarence, obviously. But there was something else. She asked me, just before we went in, whether I believed a person could hear their own death approaching. Whimsy leaned forward, resting his chin on his hand. And what did you say? I told her she was being melodramatic. She laughed and said melodrama was the only honest way to go. Charming. Elfrida looked away. I didn't think she meant it. Did she say anything about the stool? No. She sat, she adjusted her skirt. She played the first 2 bars and then, yes, he stood. You've been very helpful. Last question, Miss Smott. When was the last time you saw Mr. Haskins? She looked surprised. Not since the day before yesterday, I think. He was pruning the yew hedges and grumbling about squirrels. Whimsy nodded, made his farewells, and left the library with the air of a man whose interest in botany had just become rather serious. He found Inspector Moffat in the morning room, making painstaking notes while attempting not to upset an arrangement of dried lavender. Haskins, Whimsy said by way of greeting. What do we know? Moffat glanced up. Been here 12 years, lived in the gardener's cottage on the west edge of the grounds. War veteran, bit odd, but competent. Quiet. Mind if I borrow him? Be my guest. He's in the tool shed, probably greasing something. Whimsy made his way across the lawn, boots sinking slightly in the recent rain. The shed loomed squat and grimy behind a stand of rhododendrons, its roof cluttered with tiles that had long since given up on alignment. Inside, it smelled of turpentine, rust, and ancient soil. Mr. Haskins was oiling a pair of shears, wearing a waistcoat so patched it might have qualified as camouflage. Morning, Whimsy said cheerfully. Haskins grunted. Fine work on the piano, Stool. Another grunt, sharper this time. Tell me, did you make the replacement leg yourself? I did. Rather a good match, all things considered. Did my best. Didn't have much to work with. I imagine not. And did you varnish it yourself? Had to. Nasty business, that. Stuff gets under your nails. Did Miss Keene sit on it during rehearsals? No. No? Wouldn't touch it. Said it looked like a painted toothpick. Brought her own stool for the practices. But not for the performance. No. Why? Haskins hesitated. Don't know. Seemed tense. Snapped at me when I asked if she wanted it fetched. Whimsy nodded, slowly. Interesting. One last thing. Do you recall where the broken leg from the original stool went? Burned it. Fire pit behind the cottage. Efficient. Didn't want clutter. Lady Dormer said it was rubbish. Ah, yes. So sentimental. Whimsy left the shed, feeling the wind rise a notch. The clouds were gathering, slate and slow-moving over the tops of the trees. The house loomed behind him, shuttered and still, like a stage awaiting its final act. The motive, he thought, was always the last piece to show its face, yet the means had begun to shine in clear relief. Someone had known the old stool was to be replaced. Someone had either arranged for the leg to splinter, or else left it just strong enough to seem sound. A rehearsal without the stool. A performance with it. A change in music, timing, pressure, intensity. He returned to the drawing-room once more, this time ignoring the constable and going straight to the piano. He sat, adjusted the lid, and mimed the prelude. The left pedal, when struck forcefully, sent just enough jolt to crack an unstable support. A player lost in performance wouldn't notice the slight wobble until it gave entirely. He rose, turned to Moffat, who had joined him. "She died," Whimsy said, "because someone knew she would choose that piece, because someone knew she would sit on that stool, because someone made certain it would fail exactly then." "You think it was meant to look like an accident?" "No," said Whimsy, eyes narrowing. "I think it was meant to be an accident, but with just enough uncertainty to make the question hang in the air. A very subtle form of murder, Inspector. Subtle, elegant, and deeply personal." "Any suspects?" "Oh, yes," Whimsy murmured. "And I think it's time we paid Lady Dormer a little visit. I believe she's still sulking over the loss of her tea hour." Lady Dormer was found in the blue sitting room, a chamber of faded brocade and territorial china dogs, looking like a deposed regent presiding over a small empire of crochet and disapproval. She was wrapped in a tea gown that resembled a diplomatic curtain and held a bone-handled lorgnette, which she deployed less for vision than for punctuating her opinions. "You will have some lapsang, Lord Peter," she said imperiously, before he had so much as crossed the threshold. "Unless you are one of those regrettable men who insists on Darjeeling in the afternoon. Mr. Moffat, milk and no sugar, I assume. You look like a man who distrusts pleasure." Moffat opened his mouth and closed it again, like a landed trout. Whimsy accepted his cup gravely and lowered himself into the spindly armchair, which gave a creak of protest and then submitted. "I do appreciate you receiving us, Lady Dormer," he said, warming his palms against the tea. "It's never pleasant to entertain when one's household has suffered a, shall we say, critical diminuendo." Lady Dormer sniffed. "It is, at the very least, indecorous. A guest dying on my polished floorboards under my chandelier. Yes, I should think even the crystal was scandalized." She sipped. Miss Keene was not a well-balanced girl, passionate but unsound. In her temperament or her playing? In both. She approached everything with that dreadful romantic intensity, the type of person who cannot take a glass of sherry without behaving as though she's drunk Lethe from a Grecian urn. You know the sort. Whimsy did, though he doubted Miss Keene had much in common with Keats or Grecian pottery. "She came often to the house?" "Too often. The girl had no real home of her own, some provincial aunt who kept parakeets and did amateur spiritualism, and she took any opportunity to anchor herself here. She believed she was destined for greatness." "And was she?" Lady Dormer paused, set her cup down with precise disdain. "Perhaps, but the world is cluttered with talent. It is manners that are truly rare." "Of course. And yet you allowed her to perform. That suggests a degree of patronage. One must be generous, Lord Peter. Even with talent one doesn't particularly admire." He inclined his head. "So you funded her?" "Occasionally. Lessons, tuition, the occasional dress. She was entirely impractical, dreamy as a duck in thunder." Whimsy glanced at Moffat, who was frowning studiously into his saucer. "And the stool? It belonged to you, I understand?" "To a cousin," she said shortly. "The Honourable Sybil Fenchurch. Played at Queen Mary's garden party, though she bungled the minuet. It's been in the house for decades. I believe it was repaired recently." Lady Dormer's mouth tightened. "Yes. One of the legs cracked at the spring recital. I should have had the whole thing replaced with something tasteful from Harrods, but Haskins insisted on mending it." "And you allowed that?" "It seemed economical." Whimsy smiled faintly. "Indeed. And may I ask, was it your suggestion that Miss Keene use the stool during the performance?" "She never asked. It was simply placed there. What else would she sit on? Her own stool, perhaps?" Lady Dormer narrowed her eyes. "That hideous thing? all modern curves and German lines. She might have brought it, but she left it in the rehearsal room. Ah, one forgets in tragedy that taste may still triumph over instinct. There was a silence. Moffat cleared his throat. Lady Dormer, did Miss Keene ever speak to you about anyone threatening her? Any trouble with gentlemen? Oh, always, she said with a shrug. She had more moods than a weathercock in March. One week it was heartbreak, the next poetic inspiration. She spoke of Clarence March once or twice, though I believe that was over long before this. Do you know what caused the break? Cassandra was cleverer than Clarence. That is always fatal to romance, particularly if the cleverness is visible. I see, said Whimsy. She leaned forward, eyes shrewd. Tell me, Lord Peter, do you believe this was murder? I believe it was no accident, he said, watching her. She inclined her head slightly, like a queen acknowledging a subject's impertinence. Then I hope you find whoever turned this house into a stage. When they had left the blue sitting room, Moffat turned to Whimsy, his lips pursed. You think she's hiding something? I think, said Whimsy, that she's far too intelligent not to be. The question is what? They crossed into the east wing, which Lady Dormer had mentioned only obliquely. Abandoned for practical purposes was her phrase, and which still bore the dust and disuse of an era disinclined to sentiment. The corridor smelled faintly of dried flowers and mothballs. At the end was the old rehearsal room, once the heart of amateur sonatas, now used only by the musically desperate or the deeply nostalgic. Whimsy unlocked the door with a key borrowed from Haskins and stepped inside. The room had a low, slanted ceiling and poor acoustics, hence its retirement. In the corner, covered with a dust sheet, was a second piano, less grand and more upright in nature. Near it, pushed behind a stack of canvas screens, was a small, peculiar item of furniture. Whimsy pulled back the screen. Well, well. There stood Cassandra Keene's stool, curved wood, black leather top, oddly modern against the Edwardian dust of the rest. He lifted it, turned it upside down. No splinters here, no chance of cracking even under an aria. She played on this until the very day of the recital, Elfrida said. Moffat looked on. So she switched stools for the performance. She didn't. The household did. Her stool was never moved. But she didn't fetch it. No, because she was too tightly wound, because something had shaken her. Whimsy stood still, eyes fixed on the empty piano. She asked if one could hear death coming. That's not stage fright, Moffat. That's knowledge. You think she suspected something? No, I think she recognized something. A sound, a message, an implication. He tapped the top of the piano gently, listening to the echo. Let's reconstruct a few things. The broken stool leg, replaced by Haskins, seemingly harmless. But it was given a false leg, sufficient to bear ordinary strain but not the impact of Rachmaninoff. No rehearsal on it, so no stress test, only the final performance. Moffat scratched his head. But why all the drama? Why not poison her tea or push her down the stairs? Because the killer wanted ambiguity, a collapse in public, a musical death, if you like. Very dramatic and yet uncertain, a whisper of fate rather than a dagger. Someone theatrical, or musical. Whimsy looked again at the stool. She sat, she played, she fell. But what if she recognized something in that moment that told her precisely who had done it? Moffat blinked. And if she did? She had no time to say, but I wonder if she left a trace. He bent low, examining the floor beside the piano, where the edge of the carpet curled slightly. With a careful hand, he lifted the rug. Beneath it was a sheet of music, neatly folded, edges slightly crushed. He opened it. Not Rachmaninoff, but Schubert, Der Tod und das Mädchen. Moffat peered over. That's not what she played. No, but perhaps what she intended to. Whimsy's mouth curved, ever so slightly. Death and the maiden, Inspector. And I rather think the maiden had something to say. He tucked the sheet under his arm. Come, I think it's time we had a word with Clarence March, preferably somewhere without a piano. Clarence March received them in a room that seemed to have been arranged by someone determined not to reveal any personal taste. Brown books, brown walls, and an armchair that was so vigorously neutral in tone it might have been camouflage in a gentleman's club. The only flash of life came from a gilt-framed photograph on the sideboard. Cassandra Keene, unsmiling, seated at a piano, her eyes watching the camera with the defiant candor of the very young or very wounded. March himself was of the lean, pale type that gives the impression of being perpetually under electric lighting. His collar was too stiff, his eyes too restless, and he shook hands with a precision that implied distrust of warmth. His voice, when he used it, had the careful elocution of a man who has practiced it before a mirror. "I presume," he said after the ritual of cigarettes and disingenuous hospitality had been observed, "that this is in connection with Cassandra." Whimsy selected a cigarette with the air of a connoisseur choosing a dueling pistol. "You presume quite correctly," he said, "though in fact I was rather hoping you might illuminate a few dark corners. After all, you knew her. Intimately, if Lady Dormer's drawing-room gossip is to be trusted, which of course it usually isn't, but which is nonetheless rather more entertaining than the Times crossword." March flinched fractionally. "We were close at one point. And then she became difficult. A tragically common ailment. What form did her difficulty take? Excessive genius, improvised arpeggios, or was it the age-old madness of expectation?" "She was obsessive," said March, with a quick glance toward the photograph. "She thought music, her music, ought to matter to the world. She wasn't wrong, perhaps, but she carried it like a vendetta, against herself, against anyone who didn't believe enough." "Did that include you?" "I believe I told her the truth. That belief wasn't enough. That brilliance didn't guarantee success. She called it betrayal. And so you parted." "Yes." "Amicably." March's jaw tightened. No one parts amicably from Cassandra Keene. Whimsy exhaled slowly. "Tell me, did she ever express any fear in your presence? A sense of danger?" "Only metaphorical. She was always speaking in symbols. Death, fate, eternity, all that overcharged romantic vocabulary." "Did she ever mention the Peace der Tod und das Mädchen?" March looked up, startled. "Of course. She adored it, too much. She said it had the right texture of beauty, something that knew it was rotting beneath. She left a copy of it under the carpet. That sounds like her. But not like something one drops by accident." "No," March admitted. "She'd never misplace music. It was always sacred." Whimsy leaned forward, balancing the cigarette in his fingers like a conductor's baton. "You were at the recital. Did you notice anything odd that evening?" March hesitated. She was distracted. Not nervous. Cold. She barely acknowledged me, as though she'd already moved beyond people, like she had her eyes fixed on some invisible horizon. That horizon proved rather nearer than expected. Moffat, who had been watching silently, now spoke. "Mr. March, what do you know about the stool she played on?" "The antique thing?" "Only that she hated it. Called it an affront to ergonomics. Said it was like sitting on a spiteful biscuit tin. She never used it in rehearsals, but she used it that night." "Yes, I remember. It surprised me." "Did she say anything about it?" "No, but she looked down at it before she sat, as though she recognized something." Whimsy's gaze sharpened. "Recognized?" March shrugged. "I don't know. A hesitation, and she played as though it were the last thing she'd ever do." "In that," said Whimsy softly, "she was tragically correct." He rose slowly. "Thank you, Mr. March. You've been extremely helpful, almost suspiciously so. March frowned. What do you mean? Only that your answers are extremely coherent. And yet I find myself curiously dissatisfied. But don't worry. I'm sure it will pass. Outside in the car, Moffat fumbled with his notes. He's hiding something. Of course, said Whimsy, lighting another cigarette with academic slowness. But whether it's guilt or shame remains to be seen. Tell me, do you know what a double-bottomed music stool is? A what? A little furniture joke. Some of the old ones had concealed compartments, handy for storing sheet music or embarrassing correspondence. You think someone tampered with it? I think, said Whimsy, that someone made a substitution. The leg was replaced, yes, but not in haste. It was restructured to appear sound. Someone wanted her to sit on that stool, and not just for nostalgia. He took a small notebook from his coat and flipped to a page near the end. Elfrida said Cassandra had an argument with someone the day before the recital. In the hall, near the green room. It wasn't Clarence. He wasn't in the house. And it wasn't Lady Dormer, who hadn't come down yet. That leaves roughly 4 candidates. Haskins, the maid Gwen, the violinist Hilliard, or, most interestingly, the accompanist, Miss Merton. Why her? Because she vanished immediately after the death, citing shock. She hasn't returned, and she was the only one who sat with Cassandra during rehearsals. If someone tampered with the stool or the sheet music or planted something, she'd be in the perfect position to know. Moffat scratched his chin. So we find Miss Merton. And we find out, Whimsy said, what was said in that corridor, and more importantly, what wasn't. They returned to Litchett St. Giles by dusk, the windows of Dormer Court lit like watchful eyes across the moorland. The house had resumed its quiet grandeur, as if rehearsing for a future in which murder was once again only an unfortunate footnote in the family history. Gwen, the young maid, was found in the scullery, wringing out tea towels with the tragic solemnity of someone expecting to be questioned at any moment. Miss Merton, she said, eyes wide. She was upset that day. Real pale, like she'd seen something she shouldn't. Cassandra cornered her in the passage, right after rehearsal. Told her to be careful. I heard her. Careful how? Asked Whimsy. She said, he watches everything now, even the rests. Whimsy froze. Even the rests? Yes, sir, that's what she said. I thought it was something to do with music. Whimsy stood absolutely still for a moment. Then he gave a low whistle. My dear Moffat, I do believe we've been looking in the wrong bar. It's not the notes that kill. It's the silence. He turned to the maid. Tell Haskins I should like the stool removed to my room, and fetch me, if you would, a metronome. I have a suspicion that Cassandra's last performance was orchestrated in more ways than one. And Miss Merton, my lord? Moffat asked. Oh, we shall find her, said Whimsy with a glint in his eye. She's hiding not out of guilt, but because she saw the killer tuning up. The metronome arrived in a red velvet box with a chipped corner and the smell of camphor about it. It ticked with a zealot's certainty, splitting time with all the compassion of a hangman. Whimsy set it upon the escritoire in his borrowed room, just beside the disassembled music stool, now lying on its side like a felled animal. He peered down at the hollowed interior with the satisfaction of a man presented with a recalcitrant crossword. There's something foul here, Moffat, he murmured, and I don't mean the glue. Cassandra's remark to Miss Merton. Even the rests. It's not merely poetic affectation. It's an indictment. Moffat crouched beside the stool, sniffing the splintered wood. Do you really believe this contraption could have been tampered with to cause her collapse? I believe it's a stage, said Whimsy, rising to fetch the metronome, which he set ticking atop the stool. And I believe the performance was engineered by someone who understood timing far better than passion. Consider this. Cassandra Keene was a creature of discipline. She did not believe in artistic accident. Every note, every breath, every rest was calculated. But a rest, said Moffat, is silence. Exactly, said Whimsy with a sudden, boyish grin. Silence is terribly revealing, especially when it's timed. He tapped the side of the metronome, adjusted the tempo, and stood very still, listening. "Moffat, shut the door, and hold your breath." For a long moment, there was nothing but the click of the pendulum, meting out time with evangelical rigor. Then, on the second pause after every fifth tick, a barely perceptible creak came from within the base of the stool. Faint, rhythmic, a hollow resonance as though something had shifted ever so slightly in response to weight or vibration. "Spring mechanism," said Whimsy. "Or rather, a pivoted insert, possibly pressure-based. Something that responded to her movement as she played. You see? She sat, she played, she leaned, and the stool began to betray her. But what would it do? Collapse? No. Too theatrical, and far too unreliable. No, what it did was release something, ever so slowly, a powder, perhaps, absorbed through the skin, an alkaloid, or a gas, in infinitesimal quantities. But wouldn't that take too long? Not if one knew precisely how she moved, when she paused, when she'd lean. Which, of course, someone did. Moffat's brow creased. But she played that same piano every day. Yes, but not that stool. Gwen said she never rehearsed with it, only used it for performance. Why? Because someone made sure she only encountered the tampered stool that evening. Moffat sat back on his heels. The replacement leg. Ah, Whimsy smiled broadly. Now you're ticking in time, old man. The leg was swapped. It was said to be a practical repair, but in truth it was the means of installing whatever mechanism sat within. Then the killer had access to the music room and to Cassandra's schedule, and to the stool itself long enough to carve and conceal the apparatus, said Whimsy, which suggests a very patient villain, or one professionally acquainted with instruments, woodwork, and timing. Moffat's eyes widened. The violinist, Mr. Hilliard. He was always around, claimed to be passionate about antique fittings. Quite, and very quiet on the matter of Cassandra's death. Too quiet, perhaps. One might say, unmusical. Before Moffat could reply, a knock rattled at the door. Haskins entered with an apologetic bow. "Beg pardon, my lord, but a letter's just arrived for you, no postmark, left by hand." Whimsy took the envelope with a curious air. The handwriting was cramped, nervous, and angular, like notes written in the margins of a failed sonata. He read the contents silently, and his face took on a stillness more eloquent than any exclamation. "From Miss Merton?" Moffat guessed. Whimsy nodded. "She's agreed to meet. She says she knows who did it, but that speaking to the police would be dangerous. She suggests we come to the rectory garden. Tonight, 11 o'clock. She insists on discretion. Do you trust her?" "I don't trust anyone involved in this production," said Whimsy, folding the letter. "But I do believe her fear is genuine. Besides, I've always found truth rather likes the dark." By the time they reached the rectory garden, the night had grown so thick and wet it felt like stepping into a painting half ruined by tears. Miss Merton stood beneath the arms of a gnarled yew, her coat buttoned to the throat and her hair pinned so tightly it must have hurt. "I wasn't sure you'd come," she whispered, "but I couldn't keep quiet any longer." Whimsy tipped his hat. "We've brought no constables, no fanfare, only a healthy curiosity and a slightly damp sergeant. Speak freely." She hesitated. "Cassandra told me the day before the recital that someone had been testing the acoustics of the room. She said things had been moved. Not obviously. The metronome was off by 2 ticks. The piano bench had been shifted slightly left. She thought she was being made to doubt herself. A gaslight by means of chamber music," said Whimsy. "And she suspected whom?" "She wouldn't say, but she made me watch the stool, told me to check it before she sat down." "And did you?" Miss Merton looked down. "I forgot. Everything was chaos backstage. The violinist was arguing with March about his solo. Hilliard said it had been shortened. March denied it. Cassandra refused to rehearse again. I never checked. And after she collapsed, I fled, she whispered. I knew I'd failed her, and I saw something, the look on Hilliard's face. Not shock, satisfaction, only for a second, but I know what I saw. Did he touch the stool? At any point? I think he did, earlier that day. Said he was examining the carving. Whimsy gave a long, low hum. Miss Merton, you've been of tremendous help. One more question. When Cassandra spoke of rests, did you take it as a musical reference? Yes, but she said it with such bitterness, as though someone had been studying the silences. And timing them, murmured Whimsy. Very good. You must keep out of sight for now. I promise you the curtain will fall soon, and the villain will not enjoy his beau. As they returned to Dormer Court, Moffat was unusually silent. You believe it's Hilliard, then? He asked at last. I believe he's capable. But belief, Moffat, is not proof. We must still catch him in the act, past or present. And how do you propose we do that? By offering him a second performance, said Whimsy. Only this time, the stool will be occupied by someone considerably less vulnerable. You mean yourself? Certainly not. My legs are no match for a scherzo in E minor. No, we shall require an actress. Preferably one with strong nerves, a weak sense of danger, and excellent dramatic timing. Moffat stared. Elfrida? Precisely. She already has the cheekbones and the grudge. And if I know anything about homicidal musicians, it's that they rarely resist an encore. He paused, the first sliver of dawn brushing the moor outside. The murder, he now believed, had been a duet, written in silences, executed in tempo. All that remained was to strike the final chord. The rehearsal was scheduled for 2 o'clock the following afternoon, under the threadbare pretext of preparing a chamber program for a fictitious benefactor in Harrogate. Lady Gwen's invention, lightly embroidered by Whimsy with details of bronchitis, diamonds, and a penchant for Schubert. The cast, hastily assembled, included a reluctant Elfrida in Cassandra's stead, Hilliard with his usual Stradivarius, and a new string of contrition, March puffing irritably at a Turkish cigarette, and a local cellist with the expression of a man who'd been promised lunch but received Brahms. Whimsy himself declined to participate musically, claiming that he had once been banned from the Royal Academy for attempting to harmonize a fugue in Morse code. He stationed himself discreetly at the side of the music room, arms folded, eyes half-lidded with the indolent poise of a cat, awaiting a mouse that has not yet realized the trap is sprung. Elfrida took her place at the piano with a confidence that surprised everyone but herself. She wore a sleek navy dress that caught the light at the shoulder, and her hair was pulled back so severely that it lent her face a tragic sort of gravity. No small feat for a girl whose usual expressions ran the gamut from skepticism to scorn. She flexed her fingers with performative elegance and cast Whimsy a sidelong glance that read unmistakably, "I hope you know what you're doing." The stool had been reassembled precisely as it had been on the night of Cassandra's death. Whimsy had inspected the mechanism himself, an ingenious contraption embedded in the new leg, cleverly disguised as a repair. The interior cavity, when triggered by a specific weight and rocking motion, slowly released an almost undetectable quantity of powdered scopolamine, enough over time to disrupt coordination, induce nausea, and finally suppress respiration. He had replaced the substance with harmless talcum and ensured that the venting mechanism remained functional. The purpose was not to harm, but to tempt. As the ensemble struck the first chord, a tentative movement in G minor, Whimsy watched Hilliard. The violinist's manner was as smooth as his bow stroke, yet there was an alertness behind the eyes, a caged restlessness. He did not look at Elfrida directly, but his gaze flicked again and again toward the stool. His fingers moved with clinical precision, but the music was bloodless, absent its usual fluency. Elfrida, to her credit, played with more than competence. She conjured a haunted echo of Cassandra's technique, light in the treble, weighted in the bass, a faint pause at the end of each phrase as if her memory had caught a chill. She tilted slightly, right then left, her foot brushing the pedal in mimicry of Cassandra's habits. Her lips were faintly parted. She was acting, certainly, but something else stirred in her posture. Not fear exactly, but an awareness of being watched. March, of course, noticed nothing. He grumbled about tempo, flicked ash onto the carpet, and insisted on restarting a movement when the cellist missed a cue. But Hilliard began to sweat. At the 20-minute mark, when Elfrida executed a tricky, arpeggiated passage that required both dexterity and balance, whimsy saw it. The brief, almost imperceptible flare of anticipation in Hilliard's eyes. He had seen the shift in her weight, the precise motion that, if the mechanism were live, would initiate the release. He leaned forward, then caught himself, pulled back, and glanced at March. When the movement ended, Elfrida gave a theatrical little cough. "Dry air," she murmured, dabbing her lips with a handkerchief. Hilliard stepped forward instantly. "You don't look well." "She does look pale," said the cellist, who had looked pale himself since they began. Whimsy raised an eyebrow. "Perhaps some air, or a dash of brandy. It would be a shame if our leading lady expired before Lady Harrogate's endowment could be secured." Elfrida gave a faint smile. "I'm fine. Just a little dizzy." There was a silence. Not the natural kind that follows conversation, but one shaped by tension. A rest, as Cassandra might have said. Hilliard looked at her, then at the stool. He opened his mouth to speak, but closed it again. It was at that moment that whimsy crossed the room. "I should like to try something," he said cheerfully. "A game, if you will. Let us imagine, for the sake of farce, that the piano stool is a murder weapon." March snorted. "Really, Whimsy?" No, hear me out," said Whimsy, his voice light but his eyes fixed. "Let us suppose that our dearly lamented Cassandra sat upon a booby-trapped seat, a cunning device which over time delivered to her a dose of something, scopolamine, let us say, a substance that renders one slow, confused, uncoordinated, a poison of hesitation." "That's absurd," said Hilliard. "The post-mortem showed nothing." "True, but only if one looks for the right thing. You see, scopolamine doesn't linger long, not unless you know to look for its specific metabolites, which I did, and which I asked Dr. Weatherby to do last night." He turned slightly. "Haskins." The butler emerged from the doorway with the quiet solemnity of a priest. "My lord, Dr. Weatherby has just telephoned. He confirms your suspicions. The secondary blood sample contained tropane alkaloid residues consistent with scopolamine." "Thank you, Haskins. Do bring in that small exhibit case when you return." He turned back to Hilliard. "Shall we drop the charade now?" Hilliard had gone still. His fingers, so accustomed to grace, now curled stiffly at his side. "You can't prove I built it." "Oh, I believe I can," said Whimsy mildly. "You see, I took the liberty of borrowing one of your practice bows. In it, lodged in the resin, was a flake of the same rosewood used in the new stool leg. It's a rare grain, and only one person in this house habitually cleaned his bow with a wood scraper. I was restoring the leg, as a favor." "Yes. But you never admitted to that, did you? In fact, you denied any involvement with the stool's repair." "That's not a crime. No, but poisoning a woman is." Whimsy gestured gently. "You knew her habits. You knew how she sat, how she rocked. You timed the dosage, tested it perhaps on birds, small animals. Who can say? But you made one mistake." Hilliard laughed, short and bitter. "What mistake?" "You thought the rests were silence." Whimsy stepped aside, revealing the small exhibit case brought in by Haskins. Within was a delicate music sheet, Cassandra's annotated copy of the Brahms. In several places, the rests, those innocuous silences, were marked with small numbers. 1.5, 2.0, 2.25, measurements in seconds. She knew, Whimsy said softly. She was tracking her own pauses. She felt something was happening only when she stilled, and she suspected the time mattered. Hilliard swayed. She told no one. She told Miss Merton. She left the marked sheet hidden in her copy of Middlemarch in the music room. You knew she was watching you. That's why you acted quickly. She was going to ruin me, he whispered. She said I played like a machine. She was going to bar me from the ensemble, take the stipend, strip everything away. So you gave her a machine's death, said Whimsy. Cold, timed, without passion, you turned music into a metronome. Hilliard moved suddenly, but not toward Whimsy. He turned toward the stool, gripped it with both hands, and wrenched it sideways. The leg snapped. A hiss escaped from the inner mechanism as the last of the talcum spilled across the floor. He stood very still, the white dust settling on his shoes. Bravo, said Whimsy. A final gesture in perfect time. Moffat stepped forward. You'll come quietly. Hilliard nodded once. The rests, he murmured. She really knew. She always did, said Elfrida, rising from the piano with hands that now trembled ever so slightly. Whimsy said nothing for a long while. Then, very softly, there are only two kinds of silences in music, you know. Those we control, and those that end the song. The charge was laid with less ceremony than might be expected, but no less gravity. Moffat, ever tidy in his procedures, escorted Hilliard with quiet firmness from the house, leaving the drawing-room oddly airless, as though some unseen curtain had dropped between reality and the pageant just played out. The others lingered in suspended silence, not unlike the bar after a cadence, where one awaits resolution that will not come. March stared at the disassembled piano stool with a strange expression, not quite horror, not quite comprehension, while Elfrida stood with her back to the hearth, arms crossed, a look in her eye that suggested both vindication and a bitter kind of grief. It was Lady Gwen who broke the hush. Lord Peter, she said, and the tremor in her voice was disguised beneath her habitual hauteur. I must ask, did Cassandra know she was being poisoned? Whimsy turned the stem of his glass. Someone had poured sherry at some point. It was unclear who, and considered the question with an almost ecclesiastical solemnity. She suspected, he said finally. Knew. That depends what one means by knowledge. She was experiencing something. Tremors, loss of focus, the peculiar disorientation that comes with atropine-like substances. But she hadn't the scientific framework. Her notations in the score suggest a brilliant intuition at work, not a diagnosis. Like a bird knowing the sky's wrong, but not the barometer. Lady Gwen sat slowly, as though her spine had forgotten its purpose. She was trying to save herself, murmured March, half to himself. Indeed. And in doing so, she saved the case. Without those markings, those rests, her death would have remained at best ambiguous. A tragic fainting fit on an uneven floorboard. I still don't see, said March, leaning forward, why he'd risk such a convoluted method. Why not something simple? Arsenic in the tea, a shove down the stairs. Because, my dear chap, Cassandra was the beloved center of this musical hothouse. Any sudden misfortune would have flung open the doors of suspicion. But a pianist who had recently complained of dizziness, who then fainted mid-performance, perhaps from nerves or from some fashionable deficiency in her vitamin intake. Why, the death almost writes its own obituary. Elegant, unobtrusive, and, until you look rather closely, entirely natural. He sipped the sherry. No, Hilliard needed a death that told a convincing lie. One that didn't look like a murder because it wasn't a murder, in any ordinary sense. He trusted in the invisibility of familiarity. Who, after all, suspects a piano stool? March gave a humorless chuckle. You did. I, my dear fellow, am afflicted with the disease of noticing. It makes dinner parties insufferable and crime scenes rather compelling. The wind had picked up outside. A high wuthering sound passed briefly down the corridor, stirring one of the old velvet curtains. Elfrida moved to close the door to the music room, as though unwilling to let that draught cross the threshold again. I wonder, she said softly, what would have happened if I'd played that night instead of her? Whimsy turned to look at her. Then you, Miss Merton, might have died, though I fancy Hilliard would not have taken that risk. His obsession was Cassandra, not just as a woman, but as a musician. She represented something he both worshipped and hated. You were too young, too unformed. A variation, not a theme. Would he have stopped? She asked. If she'd yielded to him, loved him. Whimsy's expression darkened. Those who commit crimes from obsession rarely draw lines at success. They move the target. A woman's affection, given freely, might have satisfied the man. But to a mind like Hilliard's, possessive, brittle, and rooted in envy, love would become something to test, and test again. One cannot love a pedestal, Miss Merton, only a person, and he had already turned her into marble. Elfrida bowed her head. It was not, Whimsy thought, in grief precisely, but in a quiet reckoning of what had nearly been. There was, for a time, a practical interlude. Moffat returned with a note from the magistrate and a constable in tow. Statements were taken, the faulty piano stool confiscated, the room respectfully cleared. March blustered a little, but seemed to understand, beneath it all, that the shape of things had changed. The ensemble, whatever it had once been, was fractured beyond resumption. Whimsy retired to the library as dusk bled into the mullioned windows. He had asked for tea but did not drink it. Instead, he stood before the fireplace, turning over the marked sheet of Brahms in his hands. The rests, the silence, the eloquent little gaps that had spelled Cassandra's understanding, her message beyond the grave. He was there still when Lady Gwen entered. She carried a thin bundle of papers, which she offered without flourish. Her letters, she said, to me, to her solicitor. I had them in the safe. She left no will, but she left questions. Whimsy took them delicately, like vellum in a cathedral. She was considering leaving the ensemble, Lady Gwen said. There's mention of disbanding it, or at least removing Hilliard from its operations. She felt something in the house was turning rancid. She couldn't quite name it. She sensed the rot, murmured Whimsy. Lady Gwen looked at him sharply. And you? What will you do now? Me? Whimsy smiled faintly. Oh, I shall slip away, I expect. London beckons, and I've a long-standing grudge match with a crossword editor at the Times. But before I go, tell me something. Yes? If Cassandra had asked, if she had said plainly, I fear for my life, what would you have done? Lady Gwen looked at the window. Her profile in the firelight was not softened, as one might expect, but sharpened, like a cameo cut from brass. I don't know, she said. Perhaps nothing. We had grown formal of late. She was pulling away, and one doesn't like to pry. Whimsy said nothing, but something in his silence made her glance at him quickly. You think that makes me a coward? I think, said Whimsy gently, it makes you human. He left the letters on the desk, patted them once, and reached for his hat. Outside, the air was sharp with peat smoke and an incoming frost. The grounds of Little March Abbey stretched before him, deceptive in their serenity. Somewhere in the west, an owl called once, then twice. It was nearly dark. Elfrida was waiting near the gate, gloved and cloaked. You're going, she said. I am. Thank you. I did very little. Cassandra left the clues. You heard the music. She taught me too. Whimsy smiled. Then perhaps that is her true legacy. He tipped his hat, took one last look at the old house with its secrets and symmetries, and stepped into the night, leaving silence behind him, the kind that lingers not from absence, but from understanding. It was not until the following morning, after a remarkably bumpy train ride back to London and an even more disagreeable breakfast consisting chiefly of indifference and scorched toast, that Lord Peter Wimsey found himself once again immersed in the detritus of the case. Not at Little March Abbey, which had fallen behind him like a curtain drawn at the end of an awkward play, but in his Piccadilly flat, seated cross-legged on the carpet amidst a rather solemn pile of correspondence, scribbled notes, and photographic enlargements of Cassandra Vale's annotated Brahms. Bunter, observing his lordship's state, wisely brought a pot of fresh Darjeeling and refrained from making comment, save a discreet, "There is a letter, my lord, which arrived this morning from Lady Gwen March." It was marked urgent in a rather uncompromising hand. Wimsey took it without enthusiasm. The handwriting was indeed uncompromising, sharp, economical strokes, a kind of anti-calligraphy. He slit it open with a fruit knife, the letter opener having vanished days ago into some unknown drawer. "Lord Peter, there is a matter I failed to mention, perhaps because I did not at the time believe it pertinent, or perhaps, more honestly, because it unsettled me." Cassandra kept a locked drawer in the clavichord room. I believed it to contain spare scores or perhaps the odd packet of concert receipts, Cassandra being stubbornly private about her finances. Yesterday, upon returning from the constabulary, I found it broken open. Its contents are gone. All that remained was a scrap of paper wedged beneath the velvet lining, which Elfrida discovered. I enclose it herewith. I do not know what it means, but I suspect you might. Yours, in haste and increasing unease, Gwen March enclosed was a scrap of manuscript paper, not more than a few inches wide, bearing a peculiar cluster of symbols. Not musical notes exactly, at least not in the orthodox key and clef sense. There were fragments of rhythm and something like cipher, a descending scale interrupted by erratic ink dots, little cross-hatched lines, and a strangely placed fermata that hovered in the middle of a bar, quite impossible in conventional terms. Wimsey stared at it for some minutes. Then he reached for a magnifying lens and frowned. "It isn't music," he muttered. "It's something pretending to be music." Bunter appeared in the doorway like an efficient ghost. "If I might suggest, my lord, that scrap bears a remarkable resemblance to some of the encoded notations used in wartime field transmissions. The fermata, for example, may represent an instruction to pause or hold, but outside its usual context, it could indicate a break in cipher." Wimsey looked up. "Bunter, you continue to frighten me." "Thank you, my lord." "Well then," Wimsey said, rising, "we had better call in our old friend Pym from the Foreign Office. If Cassandra was in possession of sensitive information, the murder might be only part of a much less musical affair." But Pym, when telephoned, had never heard of Cassandra Vale, and seemed more concerned about a leak in Vienna. "I doubt very much your pianist was a spy, Wimsey. They do not, in my experience, favor Brahms. Try something simpler. Smuggling? Blackmail?" "Possibly," Wimsey said, hanging up with a sigh. But the notion lodged. Later that afternoon he received another communication, this time a telegram from Elfrida. "Need to speak urgently. Something wrong with March's story. Come alone." The address was a private studio flat in Camden, small, discreet, and a far cry from the architectural self-regard of Little March Abbey. Wimsey arrived as dusk fell, casting long shadows over the empty stairwell. Elfrida answered the door herself. She looked pale, tired, and slightly shaken. "It's about the drawer," she said at once, before he could even remove his hat. "I remembered something. Cassandra kept a notebook. Something bound in red leather, like a diary, but I'm sure it wasn't. I saw her with it twice. both times after those strange fainting spells started. She said it was just for recording finger exercises, but I caught a glimpse once and it wasn't musical notation. It was numbers, dates, names. And it's missing? Completely. Whimsy considered this. Lady Gwen said the drawer was broken into after the arrest. Did she? Because I think it was done before. I think Cassandra knew someone had been through her things. I think that's why she stopped practicing in the main room, why she wrote everything down in riddles. She was trying to protect something. And what would that something be? Elfrida looked away. I think she knew Hilliard wasn't the only one watching her. There was a pause. You mean someone else in the house? I don't know, but she was afraid, more than she let on. I didn't see it at the time, but I do now. Whimsy gave a long, low hum, then stood. I think it's time I paid one more visit to the Abbey. Something about the whole affair smells, how shall I put it, unmusical. It was late when he returned to the estate, uninvited but not unannounced. March received him with a courteous confusion that bordered, perhaps, on anxiety. Something more to ask, the baritone inquired, offering sherry out of reflex. Whimsy declined. Only a trifle. I was reviewing the servants' rota and I noticed something curious. Your butler, Tompkins, is listed as off-duty the evening of the performance, yet several accounts place him in the hall afterward. March shrugged. He returned early. Some family thing fell through. Ah, yes, the fictional aunt. March stiffened. Only, Whimsy continued, there is no Tompkins. No record of him under that name in the National Registry, nor under any of his aliases, which are, if you'll forgive me, rather badly chosen. It seems your butler was a man named Lionel Vess, formerly of the Theatre Royal Bath, specializing in character parts. Bit of a dab hand at makeup and accents. March's face had gone oddly blank. So you see, Whimsy said softly, Hilliard may have planned the mechanism, but someone else made sure the stool was set. Hilliard never touched it. He never left Cassandra's side during the prelude. But your butler, that helpful, hovering presence, he could have done anything. March exhaled. And you've told the police? I wanted to give you the courtesy of confirming it first. You protected Hilliard, didn't you? Not because you believed he was innocent, but because you knew the real danger was elsewhere. Cassandra found out. That's what the red notebook held. Indeed. And now it's missing. March moved to the fireplace and stared into the coals. I didn't want it to come out, he said slowly. It would have destroyed the ensemble, the work we've done. Cassandra, she wanted to expose it all. She said there was a rot in the house. She was right. But silence, Whimsy said, is not absolution. March turned. What will you do? I shall give Moffat the name and let the law proceed. You've been very brave in your way, March, but rather late. Cassandra gave us the rests, the pauses, the signs. We just had to learn how to listen. And with that, he left. The next morning, the Times bore a discreet notice. Lord Peter Whimsy has returned to London after assisting in an inquiry into a sudden death in Gloucestershire. No further comment was offered. Beneath it, a short review of a memorial concert read, though the piano was silent, the room echoed with her presence. Cassandra Vale remains, in silence as in sound, unforgettable. It was 2 days later, and Lord Peter Whimsy was once more in his drawing-room in Piccadilly, now modestly tidied of cipher scraps and sherry glasses, but still bearing the weary air of a salon recently disturbed by high emotion and low intentions. The piano stood silent. Bunter had dusted it with exaggerated delicacy, and a faint scent of lilac lingered from a bowl of hothouse blooms no one quite remembered acquiring. Whimsy stood at the window, hands clasped behind his back, contemplating the activity of the street below, with the ruminative air of a man who has at last deduced how the magician pulled the rabbit from the hat and has half a mind to tell the rabbit. He turned when Inspector Moffat was shown in. The policeman was looking unusually alert, the bags under his eyes taut with satisfaction. "Well, Lord Peter, we've picked up Vess." He was halfway to Dover, bad wig in his valise, theatrical glue still under his nails. Didn't deny a thing. Not once he knew the game was up. Whimsy gestured him to the armchair. "I do so admire a criminal with a sense of punctuality. What was the motive, finally? Money? Jealousy? The usual operatic chorus?" Moffat gave a sardonic smile. Bit of everything. He'd been blackmailing March, it seems. Something from the past, though March wouldn't say exactly what. Cassandra found out. That red notebook of hers had dates and payments in it, all coded in her peculiar musical way. She must have confronted March, who denied everything, but it was clear she intended to go public. Vess took matters into his own hands, said he couldn't risk it coming out, not after everything he'd built, as he put it. A real sentimentalist. "He built the lie," Whimsy murmured. "Brick by brick, or perhaps bar by bar." "And March?" Whimsy sighed. "Not guilty of the murder, but guilty of cowardice, which is not yet an indictable offence in Gloucestershire, though I suspect the Home Office may wish to revisit that." Moffat leaned forward. "You knew before you came back to the Abbey, didn't you? About the Stool, about the cipher. All of it." "Oh, Moffat," said Whimsy, smiling faintly. "I suspected. But one must let the music play out, even if one knows how the movement ends." The inspector considered this for a moment. "And the cipher?" "A clever girl, Cassandra," said Whimsy. "She used a system of rhythmic durations tied to solfège syllables. Looked like avant-garde musical notation, but in fact it was an adaptation of the Polybius square. Music as matrix. Bunter cracked it, naturally. The notebook named LV, amounts paid, and a charming if unkind epithet regarding Vess's theatrical talents. She saw what was happening and tried to trap him. She did trap him, Whimsy corrected. The drawer, the cipher, the coded annotations in the Brahms. The real performance wasn't the concert. It was the one she laid out in clues and rests and cryptic half-phrases. She knew Vess would come for the notebook eventually. She hoped someone would know how to listen. Moffat nodded slowly. "It's tidy. Neat." Whimsy arched a brow. "One rather hopes not too neat. Murder should never be as symmetrical as sonata form." He rose and wandered toward the fireplace, fingering the thin volume of verse lying open on the mantel. "People always say she was cold," Moffat said abruptly. "You read the papers? The critic in the Telegraph called her icily brilliant and tragically detached." "Critics," said Whimsy lightly, "are frequently wrong in matters of heart and always wrong in matters of tempo. Cassandra Vale was not cold, Inspector. She was precise. There's a difference." There was a moment's silence, during which the mantel clock chimed 4 times with an almost self-conscious delicacy. "And Elfrida?" Moffat asked. "Gone to Paris," Whimsy replied. "Something about studying leader interpretation with a blind Hungarian. Frankly, it sounds ghastly. But one cannot grieve forever, not even for someone as formidable as Cassandra. Grief, like dissonance, must resolve eventually." He crossed to the window again and looked out over the street, where the light was slanting, amber through the city haze. A lorry honked. A woman laughed. Somewhere, a piano tinkled a music hall tune with almost indecent cheerfulness. "And what will you do now, Lord Peter?" Whimsy tilted his head. "Oh, I dare say I shall read some Swinburne and drink rather a lot of coffee. Possibly alphabetize my cigars. Unless, of course, someone else takes it into their head to kill a virtuosa by means of collapsing furniture. Then we may be forced to return to the front." Moffat stood, smiled stiffly, and extended his hand. "Well, thank you for the clarity." Whimsy shook it with unexpected warmth. "It's always about the silences, Moffat. The rests, the things people don't say. We listen for the notes, but it's the gaps that tell you the key." As the door closed behind the inspector, Bunter entered, carrying a small parcel. This arrived by courier, my lord. Whimsy opened it to find a small metronome, Cassandra's. Inside the box was a single note in Elfrida's hand. Thought you might like a keepsake. It still keeps perfect time. E. He set it down gently on the mantel. The tiny pendulum began to sway, tick-tocking with quiet insistence, measuring out a rhythm no longer heard, but not quite forgotten. Whimsy stood watching it for a long moment. Then, with a small nod, he crossed to his chair, sat down, and picked up the Times literary supplement. "Bunter," he said, "I rather think I shall listen to Brahms' No. 1 tonight. The Largo, and perhaps something old and claret-colored with it." "Very good, my lord." The music, when it came, was solemn and strange and faintly defiant, as if it had known all along how the piece must end.